Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 227. This time I'm going to talk about Dexter Gordon's album from 1962, which some consider to be his masterpiece, Go. What I've got is a 75th anniversary reissue from Blue Note. In terms of what to expect, this is very much a leader's album rather than that of a collective. And if you like the sound of the tenor saxophone, this is one of the finest pieces of art you can collect. Dexter Gordon was born in February 1923 in Los Angeles. His dad was, interestingly enough, one of the very first black doctors in LA, and he was also a bit of a jazz doctor because his patients included none other than Duke Ellington and Lionel Hampton. In his teens, Dexter tried out a whole series of woodwinds, moving from the clarinet to the alto sax to the tenor sax between the ages of 13 and 15. His reputation spreads pretty quickly, and amazingly enough, only 2 years after taking up the tenor sax, at the tender age of 17, he joins the Lionel Hampton Orchestra, where he's playing alongside people like Illinois Jacquet. What happens, of course, during the war years in the States is that all kinds of opportunities start to appear for younger players because some of the older players have been drafted into the Army. Between 1940 and 43, on the back of the exposure that the Lionel Hampton Orchestra had given him, he ends up joining Fletcher Henderson, then Louis Armstrong's orchestra, and then finally Billy Eckstine's band. The other exciting development and piece of good timing for players of this particular age around this time was the emergence of the very exciting bebop scene in New York towards the end of the war in the middle 1940s. And with the exposure that he had already, Gordon, now in his early 20s, had moved to New York, and he was busily being part of that whole after-hours scene at Minton's and other places where the whole medium and sound of bebop was being developed. Around this point, he starts to appear on recordings. You can hear him on Dizzy Gillespie's Blue and Boogie. And then in 1945, he starts to record under his own name for Savoy Records. And somewhat amusingly, a lot of the early compositions he records have his own name built into the title. These include Blow Mr. Dexter, Dexter Digs In, Dexter's Minor Mad, Long Tall Dexter, and Dexter Rides Again. In 1947, after years away from his hometown and having picked up all this experience in New York and a heroin addiction, Dexter moves back to LA, where he ends up hooking up and forming a musical partnership of sorts with another tenor saxophonist, a guy called Wardell Gray. They ended up being right at the heart of a really vibrant LA jazz scene in the late 1940s, and a lot of that music didn't actually get committed to vinyl, at least not in any properly compiled way, until there was a compilation which came out in the 70s called The Hunt on Savoy. Sound quality isn't great, but you can really tell the energy and just the whole vibrancy of the scene. Unfortunately, if Dexter had been able to exploit all the opportunity of the 1940s to really establish his career, the 1950s weren't so kind. Addiction began to take its toll, just as it was for people like Miles Davis and Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane. And with that came, of course, the eager coterie of police officers and prosecutors who wanted nothing more than to put black jazz musicians in jail. And so Gordon ends up spending a lot of the 1950s incarcerated. He was jailed between 1953 and 1955. He then gets out and he makes two excellent records, actually. Daddy Plays the Horn for Bethlehem Records, and Dexter Blows Hot and Cold for the relatively obscure label Dutone. Unfortunately, the clouds of his legal troubles had only parted briefly, and he spends much of the rest of the 1950s in and out of jail. He finally gets out of jail for good in 1959. He's got to rebuild his career. Now, one of the things which the NYPD used to do to crack down on the jazz scene was to issue and or withhold a cabaret card which allowed you to play in the clubs, and it could be withdrawn by the police, not even on the basis of criminal conviction, just based on police suspicions about your involvement with drugs. Eventually he gets his cabaret card back in 1961, and that's when his career undertakes a whole new trajectory. That year he plays his first concert in New York since 1949, and he's signed to Blue Note Records, and over the next year and a half he makes 4 records which are right up there with the very best music which Blue Note ever put out. Those 4 records were made in 2 different clusters. The first of those is in May 1961, where he makes Doin' All Right and Dexter Calling in the space of 3 or 4 days. He's got some A-list talent alongside for those records, including people like Freddie Hubbard and Philly Joe Jones, and Paul Chambers, the great bassist. He then makes another couple of records, Go and A Swingin' Affair, in August 1962. And those records are both made with frequent Blue Note sidemen Sonny Clark, Butch Warren, and Billy Higgins. Of all these 4 records he makes in this year and a bit in New York, this one is his favorite. He then, after he records A Swingin' Affair, not long after this, gets an invitation to go and play some club dates in the UK and then in Europe. He was intending originally just to tour a bit. He gets there, finds that he's actually being treated a lot better as a human being in Europe than he was in the United States, and decides to stay, and famously stays out of the country from 1962 until 1976. After that extended absence, he plays his famous comeback concert in Greenwich Village, which is recorded on the album The Homecoming. All that's a very interesting story, but it'll wait for another review. This record's made August 27, 1962 at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Unsurprisingly for Blue Note, Alfred Lion is in the producer's chair and Rudy is, of course, in charge of twiddling the knobs. Van Gelder, of course, was the default engineer not just for all the great Blue Note recordings, but also for all the great Impulse recordings of the 1960s. He makes some interesting, slightly quirky choices here. The first of those is that he has mic'd Gordon's tenor saxophone at some distance compared to the much more immediate and proximate placement of the microphone, which he would do with Coltrane and frankly most of the instruments that he records. The effect is much more reverby and lush. I don't know if I necessarily prefer it. The other slightly quirky thing, which I don't know if I prefer, is the fact that he's panned Gordon's saxophone all the way over to the left-hand channel. I suppose that's fine. Some people like that, but I don't think those are people who ever wear headphones. Gordon, of course, is on tenor saxophone. He's joined, as I mentioned, by 3 Blue Note regulars, including Sonny Clark, the brilliant pianist. As far as I can tell, I think this is Clark's second last appearance on a recording. I think he is subsequently on one by Stanley Turrentine in October of 1962. He then, of course, sadly dies of a heroin overdose in January 1963. Butch Warren is on bass. He had actually only just begun his career with Blue Note as a sideman in 1960. He's incredibly prolific between 1960, 61, 62, 63. He's a good friend of Clark's. He's hit very hard by Clark's death at the beginning of 63, and that's where things begin to go off the rails for him. He's also a heroin addict, and he's also battling, as it turns out, schizophrenia. He's eventually diagnosed in 1964. And finally, Billy Higgins, who was a prolific drummer on Blue Note recordings all the way through the 1960s. I think he's on something like 700 separate tracks, not all for Blue Note, but throughout the course of his career. Side 1 starts with Cheesecake with that really well-known riff that begins it all, stated by Dexter, who also takes the first solo. He's got a lovely clean tone. The tenor, of course, is a sonically very dominant instrument, and the production, particularly the panning, only increases that effect. The other real standout for me in this track is actually Higgins. Despite the fact that he doesn't solo, this is probably the most enthusiastic and impactful drumming from a drummer who doesn't solo on a track that I can think of, and that includes people like Blakey and Elvin Jones. The next track is I Guess I'll Hang My Tears Out to Dry, which is a beautiful ballad, wonderfully stated by Dexter Gordon. He's got this very plain-spoken way of playing. It's interesting, he, of course, had been hugely influential on people like Coltrane and Rollins early in their careers, but you can now begin, certainly after his fallow years in 1950, Gordon's fallow years, you can hear the influence they're playing, I think, creeping back into this music. The final track on side 1 is Second Balcony Jump, which is an old track from the Billy Eckstine Band. Gordon's playing here, I think, is magnificent. His solo builds and builds and builds in intensity, and Clark adds in this wonderfully effortless and really quite beautiful solo as well. Side 2 begins with Love for Sale, which I think is the most interesting track on the record because of its composition. The head arrangement is actually a bossa nova beat, but whenever anybody solos, the band switches to a more traditional jazzy 4/4 beat. Both approaches swing, but it's interesting because the track at times risks going too far over the line between beautiful and clever, if I can paraphrase Spinal Tap, but it still really works, I think. Actually, my favorite part of all this, despite all of that sort of clever construction, is actually Clark's solo. Just like side 1, side 2's middle track is also a ballad, Where Are You? And just like side 1, Gordon's playing absolutely carries the whole track, another beautiful performance. And the record closes with 3 o'clock in the morning, which is pretty much Gordon just playing, frankly, an old-fashioned feeling tune just for the fun of it, I think. And there are lots of little musically comic moments in here. It starts with the big band chimes, and Gordon fits in a little riff on Take Me Out to the Ball Game in his solo, and that all brings a spectacular record to a close. This record is marvelous. Everything works effortlessly. Gordon's playing, it's confident and it's expansive. There are the kinds of little musical jokes that you come to expect from Gordon's playing, but they're never corny. They just seem to work. They just add a little bit of levity to a really, frankly, musically diverse and inventive album. It's a reminder of the ability and the musical presence of an artist whose name is sometimes forgotten when we start to list the great saxophonists. It's, I think, an essential part of anyone's hard bop collection, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.